Welcome back to another edition of Try to Disagree, where we take a triathlon-related topic and debate its merits.
Yeah, usually we discuss a coaching point, but we're going to digress a little bit this time. We're going to discuss drafting, always a hot topic in triathlon.
Yeah, we're taking a broad look at this one, and we're going to be looking at whether all triathlons should be draft legal or whether none of them should be draft legal.
Recently on GTN, we did a video, Triathlon 101, where we explained all the triathlon distances and how they came about. And in it, we had this information. In 1980, Carl Thomas, a marketing executive at Speedo, wanted to make triathlon more accessible to a wider market, as opposed to the arduous, all-day Ironman affair. He also wanted triathlon in the Olympic Games. Thomas reasoned that a shorter distance that took the elites about the same amount of time as it took them to complete an Olympic marathon would be about right. And so he created the Olympic distance, or standard distance. It took standard distances from the three respective sports and put them together. So a 1500 meter swim, a 40 kilometer time trial on the bike, and a 10 kilometer run, matching those distances for those sports that were already on the Olympic program. When it came to including it in the Olympic Games, interestingly, some countries disagreed and wanted Ironman or nothing in the Olympic Games. But Thomas and his cohorts did win out. And finally, in the year 2000 at the Sydney Olympic Games, triathlon made its Olympic debut. It's worth noting here that in order to include it and keep it more spectator-friendly and closer racing, the race was made draft legal. Essentially, athletes were allowed to draft on the bike for the first time in triathlon. And this had some implications for who was strongest at it and how the races unfolded. But it did get triathlon in the Olympic Games, even if it did separate it somewhat from the traditional longer events.
Okay, well, that's the bit of history, and that's what we're here to debate.
Yeah, essentially, back then, triathlon did a kind of mitosis, and it split into two completely separate sports with the same name, a draft legal side and a non-drafting side. Now, this is obviously most relevant to the elites because, in age group is not such a big thing. However, it does affect the sport as a whole and how the whole sport ecosystem looks. So, did triathlon sell its soul by going draft legal to get into the Olympic Games? Or was it a stroke of genius by Thomas and his supporters to create a watchable triathlon that then got into the Olympics and created the massive sport that triathlon is to today?
Well, I think your second sentence states it all. It was a stroke of genius, and that is why we see triathlon as such a still fast-growing sport.
I'm not sure I agree. I think that possibly it might have not have got into the Sydney 2000 Olympics, but it will still have got into the Olympics in a different guise if it stayed non-drafting and they stuck to their guns and said, right, now it's exciting, we're going to do it.
The thing is, with the Olympics now and the direction it's going in, everything is getting shorter, faster, more exciting. And the shorter you have that, surely the harder it's going to be to make it not drafting, because how do you have enough space to fit all those athletes in with the gaps when you've got such a short distance? And
they haven't made the marathon shorter.
They haven't.
They're not going to make the marathon shorter. The marathon's the marathon, and people still watch the marathon. I think the issue that I have with this, and yes, they are making them shorter because they're making them more exciting, essentially. And if you have a sprint distance versus an Olympic distance, the gaps are smaller when they come out the water. They're smaller between the front pack and the second pack and third pack on the bike. And therefore, on the run, more things can happen. But as you go Olympic distance, it then goes bigger gaps and less things can happen. The packs conglomerate into one group that all gets off the bike together. And essentially, on the first lap of the bike, depending on how the swimmers panned out, you can pretty much predict the winner, because you know who the strongest runner is there. And if they're in a group of 40 guys or 40 girls and the pack's together, no one's breaking off the front of that pack on these courses that they have today. And therefore, the fastest runner is probably going to win, or at least you can predict the podium. It takes the excitement out of it rather than putting the excitement into it.
I don't know, I mean, having watched the last Olympic Games, I think you would struggle to deny that it wasn't an incredibly exciting race for both the men's and the women's. And yes, Flora might have been the favourite, but the fact they were a group of five and the way the dynamics and who was going to be working on the bike, yes, there's still that pack dynamic, I'm not denying that. And then we look at the men's race with Christian Blumenfeld running away from Alex Yee, who we would have thought he would have had to break away on the bike. And yes, you might have been able to predict the podium from that group, but not the winners. And it made for just incredibly compelling, exciting racing that you could almost study those athletes, and the commentators could tell you about that smaller group of athletes, and gives you time to kind of regroup as a viewer to then watch that running race unfold.
I don't disagree. I think it is interesting, but I think instead of adding a dimension of interest by making it draft legal, you've taken a dimension of interest away. You would have that same dimension because you'd then add who's the strongest swimmer and who's the strongest biker and who's the strongest runner. The number of permutations to get over the line fastest increases, doesn't decrease. So you could have someone who's a minute behind on the bike but is a really strong runner, or someone who gets a minute's gap on the bike and no one can really catch them because it's not drafting, and they're a minute slower on the run, and it's all got to come down to their last few meters. I don't think you take anything away by making it non-drafting and making a swim, bike and run race, as opposed to having a draft legal and making it a runner's race off a pack bike.
Okay, so how do you have a sport that has such high stakes, whether it's Ironman World Championships, whether it's the Olympics, when there is a matter of subjective viewing of the draft distance? And you know, we get saddened as spectators or as at GTN if we watch a race and we've seen what looks like too close a distance, and you still in non-drafting racing you talk about the pack, and as a pro you've raced in that pack. I haven't had that experience, and you know, as an age grouper I enjoy the fact that it is pure swim, bike and run because it is not drafting, but yet it's so different for the pros because you still have that pack dynamic.
Yeah, I agree. That is definitely going to be a hurdle that they need to overcome if they're going to ever make Olympic distance non-drafting, but I think it can be overcome. I think it's not impossible. There's things like Race Ranger technology now that can definitely help with that. I think obviously the courses would have to be redesigned. You couldn't have an 8K twisty-turny loop, but the courses are not exactly the most exciting courses in the world anyway, so maybe they could do with a redesign. You could even potentially have draft zones and non-draft zones. So you have a twisty-turny section where you are allowed to be within 2 meters of someone else, and then you go into a straight section down the Champs-Élysées, for example, where you're not allowed to draft, and then it can all split up and someone can get a really good gap. You've got 3-4 kilometer where there's no drafting. They can split it up. Some people can go together, some people can't, but you can't draft for that whole section. And then when you get to the next twisty-turny section, it's all into different groups. They've completely changed. Someone can bridge that gap over that 4 kilometers. It makes the whole race much more dynamic.
Does it not make it a lot harder to explain to the viewers that don't get our sport of exactly what's happening? And you've also got that debate of how big a gap does it need to be to not have the benefits of drafting. And if it is 12 metres, or as some people say, 20 metres, as we've proven in the past, you're going to run out of space. And then that, just watching a race as a spectator, if you're there live, you see, 20 metres, there's another athlete, what's actually happening in the race. You can't sort of get that excitement if you watch, say, the Tour de France and this pack comes past. There's an excitement element from that as well, of like seeing what's happening.
I don't think it takes any excitement away. The opposite is quite the opposite. Like, okay, the next time they come through this gap where there's a 5K loop where they're not allowed to draft, is that person going to bridge up to that previous gap because he's strong enough to do it? Is he going to do it now, or is he going to do it on the next lap? Has he already done it? Is someone going to go off the front in this section? It gives a whole new dynamic. The bike becomes a lot more important, and it also brings the sport, I think, into one umbrella. Everything is the same, as opposed to where we have now, where they are very separate sports. The elite the elite draft legal racing is almost a completely separate sport that not many people participate in or you can even relate to because they don't do it. Yeah, there are age group draft legal races, but they're few and far between. The issue obviously being that it's not particularly safe when you've got different skill levels all drafting. So it doesn't translate very well to age group racing. So therefore, it almost exists as a completely separate sport in itself to what most people actually do, which is the longer distances or the distances that are non-drafting, and they have triathlon bikes versus the road bikes that the elites have, etc. They're almost separate sports entirely. And if you made the Olympics non-drafting, made it a swim and a bike and a run, you could potentially bring the whole sport back together. I mean, it's all still called triathlon, but it'll be a better ecosystem, I think.
Now, I agree on part of your point on that, of the fact that triathlon can feel disjointed in the different sports. And it's almost getting worse that we've got, even the non-drafting era, we've still got so many different types of formats and types of races. So that's probably a discussion for another day. But I think over recent times, we've seen the sport change in the way that, like we were talking before this, of how it very much was athletes could break away more on the bike, and then it became more of a pack dynamic for the Olympic distance. And now it's sort of somewhere in the middle because of the athletes we've got. And talking of those athletes, I feel like the likes of Flora Duffy, the likes of Christian Blumenfeld, the Olympic champions who've been successful, Christian even more so over the different distances, are actually helping people to be able to watch the Olympics, see their favourite athletes that maybe they then aspire to doing an Ironman with them. And yes, I agree that most spectators, myself, I've never done a draft legal race, but I enjoy watching the Olympics and I enjoy racing longer distance. And now seeing those athletes cross over has actually helped me understand that sport a bit more and feel more engaged.
Well, yeah, but I think the crossover is harder now. I mean, impressive by Christian Blumenfeld, but made more impressive by the fact that they're almost completely separate sports. One's a draft legal sport and it's short distance, and one's a non-drafting sport and it's long distance. If the short distance, the Olympic distance, was also non-drafting, you'd see more people able to transition or do both. And as it is at the moment, we've seen this year, with the Olympics coming up, Christian, Gustav in the Norwegian camp can't do both. They've now completely foregone long-distance racing from now until the Olympics because you can't do both. They can't even do the PTO events necessarily if they're focusing on draft legal Olympic distance, because the PTO races are non-drafting and they're completely different bikes and everything. You can't even use the same bike for the two events. So I think if you were using the same bikes for all the events and they were non-drafting Olympic distance, you would get more crossover. You'd be able to see someone do an Olympic distance one week and a 100-kilometer PTO race the next weekend, and then back to an Olympic distance the following weekend.
But what about, I think we should have this discussion after December the 15th and see how many of those athletes that race successfully at the Olympics are successful at the 70.3 Worlds, where obviously it's non-drafting. Maybe we pick the debate up again then.
Well, yeah, I mean, just because Hayden Wilde might win both of those doesn't necessarily mean that Hayden Wilde wouldn't have won both of them if it was non-drafting at the Olympics, is my argument. Just saying.
I mean, I do think it's a really interesting debate, and I can see both sides of it, and I'm sure you guys can too. And it'd be really interesting to hear from you as athletes who, I imagine the majority of our viewers have not done draft legal racing, but probably watch both. So let us know your thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, wouldn't you like to see them do a swim and then a 40k time trial?
He's not going to give up,
and then see how fast they can run. I'm betting there wouldn't be so many sub-29 10k runners by those guys if they had to do a 40k time trial.
I agree, but I love watching how fast they run, and I think that's inspiring.
But you can watch the track for that.
But I
Go
also
watch the track 10,000 meter.
I think that does a huge amount for our sport. The people from outside or runners watch the likes of Alex Yee going, "Oh my God, you do 3 sports and you still run that fast. Triathlon must be freaking amazing."
But do they do 3 sports or 2.5 because they were drafted on the bike? Just saying. All right, we're going to leave that there. Leave your comments down below. I'm sure this one's going to get the people talking. And we'll be back next week for another Coach's Corner. And remember, we'll answer your questions in that one. So use the hashtag GTN Coach's Corner and ask your questions related to anything triathlon training related. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.